Something that not many people are talking about is really the impact of all this on global corporates and how they're going to be seeing their business and the currency of operations, as it were. In Asia, and especially in Japan and Korea, you have large corporates that basically function on the dollar but report their earnings in the domestic currencies. How do you see that working through?
I think that there will be an adjustment. I think it will be over time. That is years, not months, not days. I think it's not just corporates. I think it's also driven by what the sovereign, the country in which they operate, will be doing. I would expect to see more countries deciding to manage their exchange rate against the basket of currencies with which they trade.
Going back to where some of them were before.
Well, back to the future maybe, but it makes sense actually. When one looks at the trade flows, intra-regional trade is rising across Asia, Asian African, Asian Middle Eastern, Asian Latin American, Asian European trade. Now, the dollar is still the world's most important currency, but it's not the only game in town.
It's funny you're saying that because a country like Indonesia, for example, that took on all the prescriptions of the IMF in the '97 crisis, is really one of the big losers in today's environment.
That being said, I'm a big fan of Indonesia. I was there a few weeks ago, and Indonesia has just phenomenal potential. But it's not just waiting for its potential, it's actually already starting to realise its potential. I think it's quite amazing that Indonesia has had an election that has not had any major problems. And we've seen a transformation politically and also I think economically in that country. So I'm a big fan of Indonesia.
And that transformation is essentially domestic. It's finally
domestic.
Making sense of its 2.5 million people,
230
million
yes,
people.
It's a lot of people.
But that's not showing up on the international equities market for international investors.
Things take time. You're right. Often it's a case of people looking at China, maybe looking at India, but not always looking at the other economies that they should look at. Now, I think that will change. I would expect, if we're right on the outlook, to see Asia's recovery coming sooner, being stronger. And even though we will not get back to the levels seen in the boom years, because that would require a booming US, and we're not going to see a booming US, one is still likely to see outperformance by Asia. Indeed, whether one's pessimistic or optimistic about the world economy, I think Asia outperforms. Now, the interesting thing there is that we need to see a rebalancing, not only of the world economy, but of Asian economies, away from export-led to domestically driven growth. Now, Indonesia, China, India are more domestically driven, but even though they can do more. And as this happens, I think part and parcel of the process has to be deepening and broadening of capital markets in all those economies.
The growing importance of the commodities market,
yes,
and how that was changing different players. Australia became increasingly a major player on the commodities front. China became highly dependent on a number of different countries and so on. How do you see that redeveloping? How do you see that story redeveloping? Who's going to be paying for what, and who will be the net beneficiaries in the rewriting of the commodities space?
Well, China's demand for commodities already this year is quite phenomenal. In some respects, they're stockpiling. They're taking advantage of the strong Chinese currency and weak prices elsewhere to buy. Who's to know whether that's the right policy to be doing? But it does make strategic sense. I think when one looks further ahead, the winners will not just be those with the financial clout like China. The winners will be those with the commodities, the natural resource. Countries across Africa, and also on the agricultural side, countries in temperate climates, Brazil, even Britain, even France. So the winners are not just in the emerging world, but certainly across the emerging world. It links into these new trade corridors. I think it's a big plus for the energy producers. I think it's a big plus for many countries across Africa. And of course it is a big strategic issue because China is not only there, but it's Russia, Iran, Nigeria, Qatar. It's not just oil, it's gas. It's not just energy, it's hard commodities. It's not just hard commodities, it's also soft commodities, and that's linked into the whole debate on water. So one of the most interesting opportunities for the banking sector is to actually be able to fund the investment needed into commodity producing countries and areas. Because as we saw last summer when energy and food prices went sky high, This reflected not just demand, it reflected supply issues, and in particular a lack of previous investment in those commodity producing countries and regions. We see a great opportunity in the future, not just in terms of the whole commodity story, but also linked into the whole environmental agenda. And that's why at Standard Chartered we're big on this whole social responsibility, and we see great opportunities in many of these countries and markets.
Right. One of the themes that came up top on the agenda during the economic crisis, really the rebuilding or the building of domestic demand, especially in large countries. There's a lot of focus on China being able to do that, but there are a number of large countries in the emerging markets. Now, what would your pick be in terms of large countries with the capacity to build domestic demand going forward?
The winners: China, India, Indonesia, Brazil. There's going to be other winners, maybe not as big as those, but equally significant.
What about Vietnam?
Vietnam is interesting. East Asian exporters are likely to be in recession this year, apart from Vietnam. Vietnam has been transformed. In fact, if one looks across East Asia, there's great opportunities across all of East Asia. But also if India starts to open up, and I think the recent election in India was one of the most significant developments we've seen, not just this year, but for many a year. If India opens up in the way I think it will, and if it reforms in the way people expect, then India could do for South Asia, for the Middle East, and for East Africa what China has done for East Asia. That means India's ties with the likes of Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda in East Africa pick up. India's ties with the Middle East pick up. At the moment, people are naturally absorbed by the cyclical downturn and the hit to markets, the hit to economies. But I think it's important not only to recognise the near-term challenges, but some of these underlying positive stories that are likely to emerge. I think India will be there. You mentioned Vietnam. I think I could sit down with you and drop a long, long list. Last year I spent 6 months of the year travelling, and some of the countries I visited, the pace and scale of change on the ground is phenomenal. And the catch-up potential is real. And markets still aren't recognising this.